First of all, this is Chris Meatyard, who's Ralph Eugene Meatyard's son, who printed the photographs that are here.
Wow.
And his wife Diane, and who's an artist in his own right, and whose poetry Merton published in his own literary journal when Chris was 13. And his wife Diane, and their two daughters, who I haven't met since named Ali.
This is
Reyes and Alphas. So,
Alphas and Smith study Korean.
Did you know one of the great things in Louisville of any awareness of Merton is that there's still people alive who knew him well, and it feels like the circle of Merton is very alive. And what's great having the Meatyards here is the circle of Gene Meatyard is very much alive in Kentucky too. So it's fun to have them here. And one of the great things about this book that Owsley and Gray and their associates produced is the cover. This is, in fact, I think the last picture that Ralph Eugene Meatyard took of Thomas Merton. He was leaving, I think, with his family, Gethsemane, in the first week of September of 1968. Merton asked for some assistance, a last-minute question about how to use his own camera. And so this is a portrait that Meatyard took of Merton, holding his own camera to his face, taking a picture of the Meatyards as they left. And Merton left Kentucky for the last time a few days later.
Oh my goodness.
And what I love about this is there's a sense for me that came about of this exhibit, which is that if there were such a thing possible as, if there were to be such a thing possible as a mutual self-portrait, I think that the work that went on between Ralph Eugene Meatyard and Thomas Merton was a mutual self-portrait. And this photograph captures kind of the concept that that might be possible in the depths of the way they knew each other in that brief but very intense friendship. This is all, one thing this is not, as you look around, you've already seen, I think these are not actually, I would not call these portraits of Thomas Merton. That was not what Ralph Eugene Meatyard was doing when he photographed Merton. What he was really doing was creating works of art in which Thomas Merton happened to allow himself to be the subject. And I think that's what makes these very special and very rare, actually, in the history of art photography. There are very few examples of anything like this. And it's important, I think, first of all, some people still don't really know a lot about Gene Meatyard as an artist. He was born in 1925, spent his adult life in Kentucky. He raised 3 children and was married, died unfortunately at the early age of 46. But he really is, I think if you asked who was the greatest visual artist who came out of Kentucky in the 20th century, it would in fact be very hard to say that it wasn't Ralph Eugene Meatyard. There might be a few other contenders, but he certainly is, right now, probably has had more solo shows around the country than any artist who produced art in the 20th century in Kentucky in visual art. The Metropolitan Museum owns 60 of his works, and yet we know still too little of him here in his sister city of Louisville, and even perhaps in his hometown of Lexington. What he did as an artist, in fact, one of the reasons he's not better known is that what made him unique is he had all of these different styles of creating his work. So many artists who are better known had one unique style. It meant that Gene Meatyard influenced a lot of other people, from Cindy Sherman to a German-born photographer named Udo Barth to Francesca Woodman to many others. But his own mark was very light because of that. And that's what he engaged in here. His art is even more unusual because he, in fact, was a self-taught artist who didn't really take up his craft till around the age 30. And he not only raised 3 children and led a full life in Lexington, he had another full-time job. He was an optometrist and ran a shop with now the title that just is hard not to think is the most appropriately named thing in the world. It's called Eyeglasses of Kentucky. For someone who taught Kentucky how to see and how to see in Kentucky, it's amazing. It was a connection that he had with Thomas Merton, this ability to see many things in one thing. And they met, Gene Meatyard eventually became friends as his photography developed in the 50s and 60s with a lot of the writers and artists around Lexington. One of them, Guy Davenport, traveled and brought him to meet Merton in January of 1967. That meeting turned into a 4-hour lunch where Merton pulled out bread and cheese from Gethsemane and bourbon from underneath his own bed. And they had a long conversation, and some of the pictures from that afternoon are in this show. Gene Meatyard, in a very quiet way, took out his camera, and Merton very willingly started becoming an important subject for him. They met repeatedly then. Their friendship was very quick and very intense. They shared letters and visits with each other over the next 20 months. The Meatyards visited frequently, and that's really almost, I think all of these pictures were taken in Gethsemane probably. And yet Merton also visited the Meatyards in Lexington. He gave his collection of Mad magazines to Chris's sister Melissa. As I said, he published Chris's poetry. He was a big supporter of the whole family. Merton, anyone who studied him knows that he was always interested in how he could pick up pocket money, because as a monk he had a vow of poverty, but if he traveled he needed to have some spending money. The Meatyards helped him in that effort by actually exhibiting his work. At this time, Merton, who was also passionate about photography and was taking pictures, was also doing these calligraphic drawings, which he then, in a very simple form of printmaking, turned into prints. G. Meatyard exhibited those prints, those calligraphies, at Eyeglasses of Kentucky. The Meatyards bought, I think, about 8 of them, maybe more, to help provide Merton with pocket money. And Chris and Diane were just extraordinarily generous in lending these original prints by Thomas Merton to us here. And it's remarkable to think that the sale of these prints provided some of the spending money that Merton actually used and wrote about how he used on his trip to Asia. When I worked this show, they had, as I said, a pretty brief friendship because Merton didn't live long enough for it to extend. And I thought it would be interesting to actually look at Merton's side of it through his journals. So all the excerpts you see here are from the day he met Gene Meatyard until his last journal entry is before he left Kentucky. The final entry here is actually from a letter he wrote Gene Meatyard from Asia after he had met the Dalai Lama, where he says, "I've met the Dalai in a flock of llamas." And has a real sense of happiness and says, "If I don't see you, I hope to see you by Christmas, but if not, send love to the family." Merton, the complicating thing when you read the journals is this was an incredibly difficult period in Merton's life. He was in incredible internal turmoil. He had just ended, at his abbot's insistence, a romantic relationship with a young nurse in Louisville. He was passionately exploring Buddhism, sometimes at the expense of his vow to Catholicism. He really wasn't sure whether he could stay at Gethsemane any longer. He was exploring other monasteries. And I mention this in part because that's the person who allowed himself to be photographed in this way. And I think that was the person who Gene Meatyard saw as an appropriate subject for his own work, in this variety of ways of portraying himself actually corresponded with the variety of ways that Merton saw himself in this time. He couldn't quite come to grips still in his 50s of who he wanted to be and where he wanted to be. It's hard to read those passages, but the thing we love about Merton is that he was real. He was just like us, even on our worst days, still struggling to find himself. The other reason that it's hard to read these, of course, is that in retrospect, we know what's going to happen. And of course, Merton did not live many weeks after he left the Meatyards and after his trip to Asia. He died in Thailand 10 days after the letter he wrote to Gene Meatyard after meeting the Dalai Lama. And very sadly, we know that Gene Meatyard didn't live a whole lot longer and died less than 4 years later of cancer at the very young age of 46. So when you look at these, on one hand, you could look at them and say these 2 young men didn't know that they weren't going to live a whole lot longer, but we know that they weren't going to live a whole lot longer. And so it's impossible for us to now see these works of art and read this writing of a great writer and not see that in it. Merton even says here, he says, "Really, I don't care one way or another if I never come back," in July 1968. So what I see both of these men, what they connected with spiritually and in friendship, was the sense that they knew life wasn't forever, that you had to find purity in friendship, in what you could observe and what you could express. And I think those are lessons that they would want us to know today, and lessons that this exhibit reminds us that they shared with us right up to their own moments of leaving us and share with us today.